Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. As always, I'm your host, Ben Ryman. Today in the studio, for the first time, for me anyway, I've got multiple guests, which is exciting. Not really in the studio because they're all in different places around the world, but we've got Tina Long, Monica Peters, and Mary Penrice-Edmondson. Welcome to the show, folks.
Hello.
Hello.
Thank you.
Yeah, exciting. So before we get started, I'll just want to do a quick acknowledgement of that I'm producing this podcast on the lands of the Tla'amin, Homoko, Klehus, and Comox First Nations, who were one nation before settlers came in and separated everybody into reserves. Texada Island, which I live on, named after a Spanish conqueror who never actually came here. He just sailed by, and someone decided to name the island after him. It's actually called Sayayin in the Tla'amin language. Anyway, we'll get right to her because this podcast is across the continent guests here, and Monica has been kind enough to share her time in Atlantic Standard Time. I don't know if folks around the world know that there is an Atlantic Standard Time. You know, it only affects about a million and a half people in Canada, and the rest of the world doesn't really know about it. But essentially, Monica's about 4 hours ahead of me, and so we're already pushing 8:30 her time, and I really appreciate Monica for staying awake and being a part of this conversation, as I do everybody. So maybe the first thing we can do, and we can kind of go clockwise based on my screen. So Mary, then Tina, then Monica. Give us maybe just a little bit of kind of an origin story of kind of how you got into the field of ABA, and eventually, and we'll get to sort of the crux of the conversation after that, as far as how you folks kind of started using the matrix and those sorts of things. So Mary, if you want to go.
All right. Oh boy, that was I was new to British Columbia when I came here from Ontario, and I was a child and youth worker, and I worked with a lot of challenging behavior, but not specific to autism or intellectual disabilities. And I had come out and tried to find some work, and I really couldn't find work in my field without there being some additional education being taken, even though I thought it would cross over, but it was in the same Canada, but there was some difference in education. And so I started, I picked up some casual work in group homes, and it was some three guys that I remember so well, because it was them who helped guide my path in terms of doing more group home work. But I worked with them casually, and eventually went to a local agency, and I was full-time and did that for several years, and moved on to another agency and did I was a manager managing multiple homes, all with challenging behavior. And it got to the point where I wanted to go back to school, and I couldn't go back to school with, the current place I was working at, because they just didn't support those kind of things. And I quit and took on a casual job as a BI with another agency that did strictly behavior, like they called it then behavior treatment homes, but it was group homes.
Right.
And I quickly left BI and was team leader, and then went back, got my bachelor's and applied behavior analysis at CAP, and finished that and did my master's. And that's how it began.
Cool.
It's group homes. Yep.
Yeah, you and I have a similar story for sure. I also came from back east. I also was working in with youth at risk with the John Howard Society. Came over here, couldn't find work, didn't have the right training, and also kind of moved over to sort of the disability realm, and quite a similar story all the way through. So yeah, it's a good one. It's a common one, but and for folks that maybe don't know that BI term, that's sort of the British Columbia lingo, behavior interventionist, or which you folks around the world probably call RBTs now. Yeah. But yeah, right on. How about you, Tina?
So I came to ABA by way of teaching. I was born a teacher, I think. I used to line up my stuffed animals to be my students and would like recruit daycare kids to play school with me. And so I did my undergrad in health education with a minor in special education. And in my state, I could teach, get a provisional license. And so I did that like right out of undergrad. I didn't have to do student teaching, which was really bad. And I failed. And so I did I was like a director of a learning center. But one time in my undergrad experience, I was an instructional assistant for like 9 weeks in an ABA classroom in Fairfax County, which is a pretty big county. And they were flying out the folks from California, Ron Leaf and John McCacken, to build up an ABA program. So I got like some intense ABA instruction, and I loved the individualization of it, the database decision making, that we start learners where they are and move at their pace. So I came into ABA really just as my teaching paradigm, instructional design, all of that. So when I failed at teaching, public school teaching, I tried a couple other things in my 23 years of life, and started doing in-home ABA, and I liked it. So I went back and did my master's and got certified, and then quickly moved out of that whole tiered model. It's not my jam at all. So then I did some behavior specialist in schools across the grades, and then started doing consultation under our state waiver, doing group homes and family homes and things like that. So I really love that consultation model. And so now I do a lot of executive function coaching, just taught a growth mindset class to some fourth graders.
Right on.
So
really cool.
teaching is what I do. And then behavior analysis is the paradigm that I choose to do it under.
Nice. Teaching is definitely your jam. I can feel it. And Monica, last but surely not least, Monica's my second returnee for guests on the podcast, which is exciting. And Monica's episode 20 was kind of around group homes and kind of the ACT matrix. And today's episode is going to be a lot about the ACT matrix. Your episode is I believe it's either my third or fourth most downloaded episode of all of them. And that not only speaks to your knowledge and expertise and great way of sort of getting information across, but it also speaks to, I think, there's a huge amount of interest in the matrix, and there's a huge amount of interest in group homes, and really talking about group homes. And I've really found that sort of throughout the podcast, and so I've appreciated you being my group home guinea pig. So Monica, you want to tell your story again? We'll see if it's any different from episode 20. I'll go compare notes later.
It might be the third or fourth most downloaded episode. I have a really big family, so all the people that listen to that episode, it's probably like half or 3/4 of my family. I suppose it's the same story as last time. I'm originally from Montreal, and I used to volunteer with this swimming, art, and gym group called Aqua Kids. And there was a little boy there, and he was nonverbal, and I didn't have much experience with folks with autism at the time. And his mom was like, "Hey, do you want to come see an ABA session?" So I did, and I got hooked, and I started with a local company there, and I was doing in-home and daycare, ABA and in-home and daycare, and then eventually moved to the clinic. And then I went down to Florida for a year and did similar, not in clinic, but in homes and schools. And then I moved out to Nova Scotia and kind of transitioned from working with children to adults, which is where I am now.
Right on. And so just for some dating, when were you in Montreal doing ABA?
Oh gosh.
Give or take.
So I would say from 2007 until 2016.
Oh wow, okay. So you definitely probably have your finger on the pulse of the Quebec ABA, which is, maybe not the topic for today, but I'm just sort of curious because I know things are kind of different in Quebec when it comes to ABA. There's not any sort of ABA programs. There's no training programs that I know of. I did have Mark Lanavaz on a while back, and he's obviously a BCBA that's doing work, but he doesn't even have an ABA program himself as a PhD there. Um, um, is it, what's it like kind of working in a major city? It's probably one of the second or third biggest city, probably the second biggest city in the country, with no sort of ABA kind of training or any kind of, I guess they do have QABA now, but no sort of a different kind of culture with no sort of education center in there. Is it a different, and not to mention it's obviously the dual language piece. Is it a completely different game than other places you've been? I'm curious. Never talked to anyone that worked up there.
It is a different game, especially when I compare Montreal to Florida to Nova Scotia. Very different. All three, being down in the States, everyone knew who BCBAs were. You could, apply for up to 40 hours a week of ABA up until the age of 19 or 21 even, or what have you. In Montreal, it was definitely different. Obviously, the pay scale was really low. We were called rehab assistants at the time. With one of the companies, I was an ABA therapist. But I kind of chose to move out of Quebec around the time that I did get certified, or within a few months, just because of those limiting opportunities. I think now there's many more BCBAs, and I think there are more opportunities. Not, I believe, I still don't think BCBAs are recognized like as a profession. In Montreal, I could be wrong, but it definitely very different. And then moving to Nova Scotia, where we're very new field, but everyone's English, and the language factor is also
and of course Nova Scotia, and we talked about this in episode 20, so we won't get into it again, but Nova Scotia has that interesting model of sort of using the pivotal response training sort of throughout the province as sort of the it's very interesting to sort of have a province-wide approach to sort of working with kids with autism, and interesting, like an NDBI, and not sort of some other method that you'd sort of normally expect. So it's interesting how from province to province it's so different in this country. Certainly, BC and Ontario are kind of have the big conglomerate of folks, but then you get into the prairies and it's really bizarre. Like 10 BCBAs in Saskatchewan or something, where strangely enough, Saskatchewan was the place where the very first published ABA study, that was the setting, was the Saskatchewan hospital, with the Ted Allion study. And so it's interesting how sort of the history of ABA in Canada is quite bizarre, and there's really no connection. You can't really connect dots too well here as far as sort of how things work. And I guess that's what happens when you sort of try to take a field that's primarily American and try to sort of generalize it to other countries. So today we're going to be talking a lot about the ACT matrix, which is a thing that a lot of people are into these days, and for different reasons. And in and of itself, the ACT matrix is and I know I'm simplifying this, but it's essentially a piece of paper with a cross on it, and essentially a visual support to sort of guide a conversation. But it sounds a whole lot more complex, I think, in some ways. I think in part because ACT in itself is quite complex, with the hexaflex and all the crazy jargon and terms that they have in there, and ACT training, which is sort of the behavior analyst sort of version of acceptance and commitment therapy, which has been around for ages, in kind of more the psychologist kind of counseling sort of realm, although originated by behavior analysts, Steve Hayes and others back in the day. It really kind of took off with sort of the therapy, counseling kind of realm, and not so much ABA. So then ACT training kind of started becoming more mainstream and more popular, but still a lot of work, a lot of crazy kind of trainings, ACT boot camps, and in-depth courses, and just a lot of stuff that makes it it sounds really cool, but it's also can be really overwhelming. And then you've got this ACT matrix thing, which seems to be just a lot more, I don't know what's the word I'm looking for, inviting in some ways. It seems like the vibe I kind of get is that, there's a lot more folks that could use a matrix that wouldn't have any clue what they're doing in sort of regular old ACT. And that seems to be okay. So maybe folks can maybe just start by someone, Tina, it seems like you're kind of, we're sort of the first user of the matrix of the three of you. And these folks have kind of done so. You've done some mentorship with Mary and Monica, and so maybe you can just maybe give us a bit of an origin of kind of where the matrix came from and sort of how its kind of foundations are connected to sort of acceptance and commitment therapy, but yet also how it and other folks feel free to jump in, but how it kind of isn't ACT. If that's the right way to phrase it.
So the ACT Matrix was created by Dr. Kevin Polk when he was working at the Veteran Affairs Hospital. He was the chief of psychology or something like that. And it originally started as a trauma word sort to give veterans who are experiencing PTSD a different way to interact with their trauma memories. And if you look in the forward, I think, of the Essential Guide to the ACT Matrix, the blue book, that's not right. I'm sorry. The Essential Guide is the beige one. The blue one, if you look in the front of that, Kelly Wilson writes a forward of when Kevin Polk went and showed it to him and some grad students at this retreat he would do at his house. And then Kelly Wilson convinced him to go to ACBS or one of the conferences and show it. And Kevin was actually the first peer-reviewed ACT trainer, I believe. And it actually did start as acceptance and commitment training.
Okay.
Originally.
Oh, originally.
Originally, it was acceptance and commitment training.
Very good.
Steve Hayes came up with the term functional contextualism to give a more attractive term to Skinner's radical behaviorism because it had lost its luster, really. And was, people were relating it to some aversive things. So functional contextualism is what Steve Hayes came up with, but it originally started as acceptance and commitment training. Okay. But the very first book that was written about it, they tacked on for anxiety, maybe depression too. But it was never really intended to be a treatment for, clinically significant, but it was about psychological flexibility and promoting psychological flexibility. But putting words like anxiety and depression on books might be attractive to certain professions. And then maybe the word therapy gets tacked on and things like that. So Kevin created it and it started out, I think it was originally called the iView. And then he was at a conference and showing it. And somebody who was like a Buddhist monk said, that needs something sexy on it. And the Matrix had just come out and he said, Keanu Reeves is sexy. And so it was called the Matrix. And then the Prosocial Matrix showed up on the way to, something else. But Kevin spent like 17,000 hours in the RFT literature trying to really simplify it, which is what it does. And the Matrix makes it accessible. So it makes ACT accessible. Monica and I have been talking more about what you need to know about ACT versus what you need to show about psychological flexibility. So as a practitioner, I maybe need to know some of the science behind acceptance and commitment training. But when I'm attempting to promote psychological flexibility in the folks who I'm working with or in myself, there's things I need to show them. And the Matrix gives me the show part of. So I don't need to tell them what I know, just like functional communication training. I don't need to teach a 3-year-old about a man and an EO and an MO and that the reinforcer matches the learner response and all that stuff. My 3-year-old doesn't need to know that. I need to arrange an environment so that functional communication comes out and then I might reinforce it. And it's the same thing with promoting psychological flexibility. The folks I'm working with don't need to know what values and diffusion are, but I need to arrange the environment so that perhaps they're engaging in some psychological flexibility and get to notice the consequences of their own behaviors.
And how long has it been around? Like when was that first veteran sort of experience approximately?
I wish I could tell you. I think early 2000.
Early 2000s. Okay.
And then Kevin and Phil, so Phil Tonelli is a school psychologist who met Kevin at a conference presentation, something. Now they work together. They are Matrix Talk, Kevin and Phil. 2009, I think, is when they really started working on it even more. I think around 2009, but I think early 2000s is when that IBAO, the two cross lines, came out.
Right. And so have all you folks done sort of, so first off, the whole acceptance commitment training coming first is new to me. That's because there's quite a bit of rhetoric in our field right now about how, ACT isn't in our scope, or ACT isn't even ABA, or all these sorts of things, and some of the rhetoric I've heard is that ACT acceptance commitment training is acceptance and commitment therapy that's been dumbed down in some way, but yet with the caveat that it was a behavior analyst that came up with it in the first place. So this makes more sense to me, and it's interesting that sort of that conversation about sort of it being out of our scope and all those sorts of things, when in fact originally it was out of their scope. but I'm wondering, and maybe part of the reason is because of some of the things you said, but any idea why sort of acceptance commitment training didn't seem to catch on for behavior analysts until kind of more recently? Or maybe I was just out of the loop until then.
I don't know. I found it shortly after finishing my master's. And I've never really liked to be told what to do. And so when I found it, I knew that it's what would work for private events and for things that make our life harder. And I never really liked traditional cognitive behavior therapy. I don't like challenging my thoughts. I don't like labeling things helpful, unhelpful. I've never found that to be helpful. And I knew that there was a behavior analytic way that we could talk about private events, talk about behaviors in response to private events, include private events in our analysis of behavior, things like that. So when I found ACT, I was like, this is it. And I just started chasing it. And, even professors who I respected really put it down. But I just kept chasing it. And I don't like to be told what to do. So nobody's ever actually to me said, ACT isn't behavior analytic and you can't do it. So I've never had to respond to that. And I don't, because the more times I send chasing trolls who want to tell me what I can't do, the less time I get to do the things that I want to do that make my life better. So,
there were, I think that statement was based on, I think that was that article that came out not too long ago from the Autism Partnership Foundation folks. They've had a couple. So they had the one that compared kind of, essentially RFT versus DTT, but then they had another one that talked about sort of, and it was the RFT DTT was a preference one. So do folks prefer RFT over DTT or whatever? But then there was another one I thought around sort of whether acceptance and commitment therapy is actually, either in our scope or is actually ABA.
So if we equate it to like math is not behavior analytic. Math is content, right?
Yeah.
And we can teach math in a behavior analytic way, or we could teach it in a non-behavior analytic way. Psychological flexibility is simply a set of skills that lead to behavior, right? So there are many people, behavior analysts included, who I have observed and who are putting on CEU events and doing things in very non-behavior analytic ways. So it's, for me, not an argument between is ACT behavior analytic or not. I mean, the underpinnings of psychological flexibility, the way that Steve Hayes developed it, and with relational frame theory are behavior analytic, but it can be applied in very non-behavior analytic ways, just like we can teach math, reading, Spanish, executive function skills, all of those things in non-behavior analytic ways. And the Matrix keeps it behavior analytic because we're teaching people to be their own functional contextualists.
Gotcha.
We get
So,
stuck. Like
yeah.
we as a field get stuck, especially when it comes to things that, are, that's too mentalistic, or I cannot see, it uses mind and thoughts and feelings, and that's those private events, and we can't see them, we can't measure them, so therefore we can't teach anything around them. And I think that's where we get stuck, or at least I know for myself, I was not really interested in that. Right. I was like, oh, no. Like, we can't see it. We can't see it. It's a lot of mentalism without actually even spending time to sit down and like go through it or learn anything about it. And I've attended a few CQ events, and it all depends on the event you go to, whether or not you grasp the information being shared. But actually it was Monica's podcast with you that I was like, hey, wait a minute, this sounds interesting. Maybe I should give this another go. And but my first step was to take, Stipe's act immersion course, and it was long, and I was getting lost. And I think that's a piece, is like you can get lost in all that information, and some of the training pieces are therapeutic. And so then our walls go up again, because we're like, oh no, this isn't, we must be able to fit within our skill set, and it must be within our scope. And so then we just go, okay, I was going to give that a try, but no, I don't think that fits within my scope, and I can get in trouble, right? Without, like what Tina described, it's like, it's how you teach it and how you apply something, not necessarily, okay, I went to this course and I've determined it's not behavior analytic. How we teach is the behavior analytic piece. How we apply things is the behavior analytic piece, right? Not just a title.
Yeah. Monica, so how did you find the Matrix? I mean, you came from, first off, you're already bouncing around the world in your career, going from place to place, and I don't think the Matrix is something that was probably being used a lot in Montreal or Nova Scotia, maybe a little bit in Florida, maybe not though. Since we did your interview, which seems like so long ago to me, but it was only a couple of years ago. It in a lot of ways, that in combination with the ABA and Adult Populations Facebook page has really sort of brought it to the point where anyone I ask about sort of, I'm struggling in group homes, what do we do? Everyone's like, well, Matrix. It's, everyone says Matrix now. And it just seems to be like an overwhelming kind of thing. But I never heard of it before I kind of met you, which makes me think maybe you had something to do with it. So, so how did you find the Matrix, and how did you kind of start figuring out that, hey, maybe this would work out well in these kind of, in these group homes and kind of contexts?
That's a great question. I'd kind of delved into a few ACT books, and not really found the jazz with it. Like I was kind of, I understood the premise of ACT and diffusion, acceptance, context and whatnot, and it just wasn't hitting home. And then at some point during COVID, Tina started a biweekly Zoom for like BCBAs or not, working with adults. And I jumped on that ship, any support that I could get working with this extremely challenging population. And Tina found Dr. Polk and Phil and told me about this really cool thing that called the ACT Matrix. And I was like, yeah, I'm a leech. I like to kind of sink my teeth into people that I respect and admire and want to follow. So I met Phil and Tina and Kevin, and I started the Matrix more for myself than for my clients. So working in group homes was very hard, and I would leave not in tears, but very defeated and just not working, just looking at, the what I was doing every day and seeing the little product and little outcome that was, happening with my work. I started to practice the Matrix on myself. And then I realized that this was a pretty cool tool, especially the Prosocial Matrix, which looks at groups and which is, group homes and tricky staff and, you know, teams that perhaps don't always have a shared purpose or even a purpose, or, you know, have different opinions and histories and stories. So once I kind of practiced it with myself, then I started to do it with the homes and caregivers and some clients, and that's how, and it kind of snowballed from there.
And so, what did you kind of notice kind of right away? Like, I mean, I think we all, everyone knows kind of working with group home teams can be a really tough gig for a whole bunch of different reasons, which we don't have to get into right now. But you know, often it's just sort of, you know, we've been doing this for a long time. We've known this kid or guy for a long time, and we know how he works. We know how it goes. And we've had so many of you people come into our house and come and leave documents, fill our file cabinet with 30-page behavior plans, and go home. And they've really sort of, you know, been punished in a lot of ways, you know, in terms of, you know, interacting with behavior consulted behavior. So I hear so much about the Matrix as being sort of this thing that can somehow, it almost seems magic. It can almost somehow change all this stuff. So what's happening when you're sitting down with a team, you know, like that, like a, you know, a long-standing team who, you know, maybe that same home that you left in tears, and now you're coming in with the Matrix, and what does that look like? Because I think it sounds really nice to have this little one-pager thing and have everyone's minds go in a completely different direction, but it also seems impossible.
You're magic. That's it.
It is magic.
We are witches.
Yeah.
And we spin, or do wizards do magic? I don't know which one.
Yeah.
I think the thing
pixie dust.
The thing that I noticed the most when I started doing it for myself was I'm a very angry person by nature. I have a sweet temper, and when I get angry, it's hard to either not show it or to not shut down. And I think when I started using the Matrix just with myself, so I'd go into a group and I would draw it out for myself. I wouldn't ask them the questions. I would ask the questions and sort it out on my own. And it helped me control my temper. It helped me realize that there is an alternative, perhaps an incompatible behavior that I could be doing when all this stuff is thrown at me. I think that's kind of what I noticed right off the bat, like immediately when I started practicing it on my own with people, with group home staff, but just for me. And then once I got comfortable with it, then I started showing it to the staff, and then I got to see, you know, staff teams like come up with these wonderful ideas and wonderful goals, and you know, from the perspective of the client, you know, keeping it you know, client centered, and you know, that kind of reinforcement came a little bit later, but immediately it was just a different way to manage my emotions and my feeling of avoidance.
So that sounds like a key piece. Something I've heard a lot about, you know, ACT itself or ACT training is that, you know, folks are really encouraged to do things like go to a boot camp or whatever, because it's really, or read one of Russ Harris's self-help books, because it's really good to sort of, and I don't know my ACT names; these are just the ones I can throw off right now. But the suggestion that it's really good to sort of apply some of those, you know, techniques and procedures or whatever, or methods to yourself first, and experience what that's like before you go in. Is that, would you all say that's sort of then a key piece of using the Matrix, is that you should be using it on yourself first before you're kind of using it with a team? Is that how everyone does that? Are you a BCBA supervisor looking to streamline your practice? Or maybe you're working towards your BCBA and need to find the right supervisor. Homehouse offers tools that make supervision so much more enjoyable for both supervisor and supervisee. For supervisors, they offer easy meeting documentation, competency tracking, monthly verification forms, a built-in supervision curriculum, and so much more. For supervisees, Homehouse has a fieldwork tracker with built-in auditing, monthly verification forms, a curriculum, quizzes, and more. If you're looking for a supervisor, they even have a supervision marketplace where you can connect with BCBAs until you find your perfect match, kind of like professional dating. For more information, go to homehouse.com/speak or search Homehouse on Google. If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to enter the 3 secret words at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is academy.
It's a bi-directional process. So you learn and promote your own psychological flexibility when you are showing it to yourself or showing it to somebody else, because the simple act of just writing down exactly what somebody responds, where they tell you to write it down, is your own practice of psychological flexibility, especially if you're doing it with somebody who's close to you or is a stakeholder. So, so you are promoting your own psychological flexibility while attempting to promote other people's psychological flexibility. And it's, like riding a bike. You've got to do it. Can't read about riding a bike. Can't do worksheets about riding a bike. Can't talk about riding a bike. You just have to get on the bike and ride.
That's also a piece, is that we typically don't share our own who's important to you when we're working with others. We tend to just ask that information from them. And when you're doing the matrix, you're actually while you're actively doing this with them, you're actively doing it with yourself, and you're sharing, information that we probably didn't do before, and it's a new process. But that's part of flexing up, is that you're actively participating in the matrix as you do it with another person.
What do you mean by, so I mean, a lot of folks will be familiar with this stuff, but I think some will. What do you mean by who's important to you? What are essentially what is the process of the matrix? Question one, and then someone else might want to jump in for part 2. I heard you mention prosocial matrix. So are there actually different matrices as well that you could use, or so maybe the process first, Mary? What's that look like?
I was like, oh, Tina will answer this one. Well, it's the 4 quadrants, and at the top is where we write down the 5 senses, and so behavior, the things we see, smell, touch, taste, all those things we do. I always run I forget 5. The 5. I don't. I'm like, there's 5.
Sure.
And then at the bottom is where we write down mind. So that's those thoughts and feelings that pop up in our head, like we're constantly chatting to ourselves. And then on one side is the where we write down we do our satisfaction, like behaviors. It's really hard to describe when we don't have the visual in front of us.
Yeah, I bet.
And then on the other side is relief. But we start with the bottom quadrant, the bottom right hand side quadrant, and that's where we ask a question. And the question for the ACT matrix, the question is, who is important to you, or what is important to you?
Gotcha.
And so when you're working your way, clockwise around the matrix, is the first question is that the bottom right quadrant, and that is who or what is important to you.
Right.
And then from there, the bottom left-hand side is where we write down all those, all that yucky stuff that pops up in our head, so in our mind. And then we move from there to the upper left, and that's where we write down, our relief behaviors, the things we do to get away from the yucky stuff. And then next is we go back to the upper right-hand quadrant, and we write down our satisfaction behaviors, so the things we do to get closer to those. The who and what's important to us.
So it's kind of like
then we draw a circle in the middle.
Yeah.
Circle in the middle.
Yeah.
And ask if we might have the opportunity to notice all of those things showing up, to notice or what's important showing up, or yucky stuff, or the things we do for relief and the things we do for satisfaction. And then there's a big circle all the way around the whole thing. And we ask the workability question, which in acceptance and commitment training, the truth criterion, so the thing that we're looking for is workability. So is what we're doing working to get us to whatever we're aiming for? That's functional contextualism. Is it working in my environment? Are my behaviors working? So functional contextualism, workability, creativity, problem solving, derived relational responding, all different questions, or all different terms for workability. So we put a big circle around the outside. And people often forget that. They forget the noticing part in the middle. We got to come to the middle and notice that's the place to be in the matrix. And then the workability, and I know people are listening, they can't see, but imagine a big circle around the whole thing.
Yeah.
And now we ask if everything that we're doing, where we're spending our time, is actually working to get us closer to whatever it is that we're aiming for. And we leave it at that. Because we can only answer that question when we're out doing things. It's the only time we get the opportunity to notice the consequences of our behavior. Whether or not our behavior is working.
Mary,
so the ACT matrix is for promoting psychological flexibility.
Right.
And then the prosocial matrix is for psychological safety.
Okay. And what's the difference?
So psychological flexibility is about creativity. It's about problem solving, resilience. It's about making contact with the present moment fully and on purpose,
right,
without judgment, without defense, and still doing the things that get us closer to whatever we're aiming for in the moment. So whether that's simply survival or closer to who or what's important or things like that. And psychological safety means that everybody in a group, so whether it's a couple, 2 people, or a classroom, or the 4 of us here, or an organization, an executive room, the White House, whatever, everybody feels safe and comfortable to learn, to contribute, but also to bring up opposition and to contradict what's being said without fear of being reprimanded or criticized or ostracized. So psychological safety is about everybody feeling safe, but it starts with psychological flexibility. But where the ACT matrix, the first quadrant is for who or what's important. In the prosocial matrix, we start with a shared purpose. So that lower right quadrant is about what's our shared purpose? What brought us all together today? And then we move to the lower left and we talk about social yucky stuff. So when we're in couples or groups, there's social yucky stuff, and then social relief and social satisfaction.
So is there sort of a question then? It sounds like you can use this sort of for any kind of issue. Is there a sort of a question like Monica, when you go into the group home, is there a initial kind of question you're asking that helps you decide sort of how you're going to flow through those quadrants? Because it sounds like I could have yucky feelings about 10,000 different things right now, and we're not going to talk about all of them today when we do the matrix. I mean, I don't like, there's lots of things I don't like, but so how do you sort of guide it to be about whatever that purpose is? I suppose with the group home, is it let's talk about Bob? Is that sort of the idea? Or
through trial and error, I use it the most. So at first meeting at the intake where I'm just learning about the person, that's how I set up the context. So immediately I say, hey, are you guys okay if it always starts with the permission piece. Are you guys okay if I show you the point of view that I work from? Maybe ask you some questions about Bob and write down what you say. And it's always a yes. Oh yeah, of course. We're just so excited you're here. And then I won't necessarily, like, throughout my assessment when I'm actually going to the house, I won't bring it out because group home staff, they're busy, they're hustling and bustling around, they have a million things to do. Once I'm done my assessment and go into like assessment review, I'll bring it back out for program planning. So, hey, you guys are familiar with this, do it again. And then at staff meetings, if it's a really cohesive staff and they have a shared purpose, they're in it to win it, they're just really supportive of the person, and they're just, things are everyone's collaborative for the most part. I won't necessarily bring it out. It's mostly if we're at a staff meeting and there's an issue, like, hey guys, we have 85 new staff starting in the next month. How are we going to keep them? What are we going to do to prevent burnout? How are we going to help the staff develop relationships with these 3 new, very challenging people, or, people with challenging behaviors or behaviors of concern? And that's when I'll bring it out. So it took a lot of trial and error because I used to bring it out and show the staff when I would go in just for an observation or follow-up, and staff would not listen, and because they're so busy. So I think just over the course of time, it's been really during staff meetings and the intake and discharge that I'll bring it up. And I find when I go, like if I have a staff meeting and we do the matrix and, develop some ideas, within a couple weeks, when I go in and do an observation, they're already implementing some of the stuff that they talked about. And I haven't even written up the plan yet. And it's so cool to see like some of this stuff, or they're excited to tell me about, oh my gosh, you have no idea what I noticed worked. And they like start using the lingo, and I'm like, I didn't even think you guys were listening. This is so cool. And it gives an opportunity to reinforce the staff because they're excited about something. And it's, instead of that aversive, oh, here comes Monica, it becomes a, yes, well, I won't go that far, but it's a more positive experience maybe.
Well, no, and I think that's one of the biggest barriers is that, as I said before, behavior consultants, behavior analysts are not reinforcing to group home staff. And so it seems like you found a really great way to be reinforcing without having to bring a box of Timbits every time. Canadian reference. It's
a model for human behavior. That horizontal line is the function of behavior. And over to the right, we have behaviors. We talk about behaviors that we do with the intent to move closer to what's important or satisfy our shared purpose. But they become behaviors maintained by access to positive reinforcement. And over to the left, it's behaviors maintained by access, escape from aversive or negative reinforcement. So in the lower right, we could consider that appetitives. In the lower left, we could consider that aversive. So it's just a model for human behavior. And when you show it to people, and don't use those words, right? But once you see it, you can't unsee it. So when people look at it, it's, even if we're talking about a client, we're really just talking about, good stuff, yucky stuff, and behaviors. And if the behaviors are working, and who are they working for? And a lot of peace shows up, I've noticed.
Yeah, I've never heard
write their own behavior plans.
Like I've never heard yucky stuff being used in an intake or an FBA. So I think that's great. I think that the terminology is really cool. Mary, you were talking about when we met before for kind of a little pre-chat about you had a really good story that I really liked about how, because you're brand new to the school system. You've been working kind of group homes and stuff for a long time, and you've recently kind of made the switch over to schools, which I get a lot of folks do, if only to have sort of a nice regular set of hours and be able to get home, be with family. There's some balance there. It's not. I mean, if you're a teacher, you don't get regular set of hours. I get that, but often as a behavior analyst or whatnot, there might be a little more structure there.
Mary, when's the last time you got to go to the bathroom today? How many times did you get a bathroom break?
How many debriefing did I had to do today? That's
fair enough. But you had a nice anecdote about sort of using the matrix on your very first day, and I'd love to hear that again.
I'm trying to think. Was it the first day or was it the one of the intakes? I know we talked about too, but my very first one was I was in a meeting. So like most of us, when we're just learning a new skill, you're not overly confident to use it right away. So I hadn't done it. I had been meeting like I think by weekly, if not more, with Tina, Kevin, and Phil, and a few others. And so I was learning. I knew it. I could do it on myself, but I hadn't been actually I wasn't using it anywhere work-wise. But I was in a meeting with a large group of group home staff, and this was, it was a follow-up from an individual I supported who had like significant challenging behaviors, even to the point where there's a couple of times where I wasn't quite sure. I was like, I don't know, what are we going to do here? But was doing well, like is currently doing super, super well. So, unsafe behaviors all gone, replaced with typical teenage annoying behavior. But, one thing that was coming up in the meeting was a concern for, a behavior they were doing that, was more to me like more stereotypical behavior, like maybe some hand flapping or stuff like that. But it was occurring in public, and it quite bothered a few of them, and they really wanted me to do something about it. And we were getting into a back and forth about like, well, is it harmful? Is it affecting their day to day? Is anyone getting hurt? And all the answers were no, but some staff were stuck. They were stuck on, it being a concern, and we must fix it because, the typical wasn't appropriate. And I felt myself getting into a bit of a back and forth. Like it was like, I would try to, redirect it to like, it's not dangerous, and think about like how much we've come along and et cetera. And I wasn't getting anywhere. And I felt it within myself that frustration and that yucky stuff, like just like, it was like filling up my pot. And I was like, you know what, I'm going to try this. And I asked them, hey, do you mind if I show you my point of view? And this is a team that I've worked with for years. And so I was at first like a little bit, I don't know if this is going to work. And so I pulled it up on the Zoom whiteboard and I walked them through the matrix, and I showed them the me loop, so the act matrix. And then, I brought out the prosocial matrix, and I asked, we started writing down our shared purpose. And it was funny because, in Zoom calls, not everyone puts on their camera, and suddenly those who didn't have their cameras on turned them on. And the ones who never spoke up. And they started listing this great list of things that they felt was important with this individual. And then we started writing up the social yucky stuff, like what's getting in the way. And suddenly people were like, well, people don't follow the plan, or, everybody reacts differently. And, I think this is important. So we sort of sorted it out and, filled up all those quadrants, and, people started there was no more like, we must do this, we must do that. There was more of this like group agreement, some head nods, and, and et cetera, et cetera. And, when we were filling out that satisfaction box, that it said, what things are we doing or could we do you think, or perhaps to get us closer to our shared purpose? And we wrote out a list of things we could do to support the individual with this concern of theirs. And, I was like, do you think we might have the opportunity to notice, these things, and to perhaps, try or continue to do some of these things and determine whether or not it's working? And they were in agreement. And so they printed it out and they put it up on their wall. And so I said, put it up, add more comes up, cross out ones that are no longer relevant, and let's see what we can do from there. And I haven't heard a thing about any concern about this behavior ever again.
That's pretty reinforcing if the first time you try it to have that big of an impact on a team like that. I mean, that had to been a pretty powerful experience for you.
It was. I remember getting off the call and being like, like, well, that was easy. And that just made everything so easy for me. Because that's the thing, is you're working in these group homes and you have all these different personalities and all these different thoughts, and everyone has different experiences, and a lot of it's based on fear. And when we're fearful, we do whatever we can to make that fear go away. Sometimes it's to hide it because we don't want to appear fearful. And sometimes we do things to make it, that isn't hidden, and it doesn't lead us in the direction we really want to go.
Really cool. Well, I know we don't have a ton of time, so I want to talk a little bit now about sort of the myriad of ways one can learn about the ACT matrix, because it seems to be a lot of opportunities out there. There's everything from, for folks that listened before, the crowdcasts that Monica was doing, and of course Tina and Mary are now also doing crowdcasts as well. And so crowdcast seems to be a really good sort of medium for sort of presenting kind of visuals in that sort of way, which is really, really cool. Question one is a couple of questions. So one, and Mary, you'll be able to relate this to this maybe more than others, maybe Monica too. But behavior analysis isn't regulated in Canada sort of anywhere. Ontario is getting closer, but so far it hasn't really happened. And so anyone can be a behavior consultant, with any level of training. You don't even need a high school diploma, and you can start going in and collecting funds from the government to kind of do those sorts of things. And so, but we often hear in the field sort of, everything comes from the US, everything comes from sort of that perspective of you got to have your BCBA, and you got to have your master's degree, and you got to have all this level of training, which I'm not sort of dismissing and suggesting that, that folks with a 2-day workshop and a 6-month community college program should go out and start designing behavior plans. But is all of this required to use the matrix, or can folks, be, anybody, and kind of come out and kind of start doing some of that training and get that experience.
Yes. My 4-year-old, well, she's now 5.
Yeah.
My 4-year-old can take you through the matrix, and I have caught her doing it at a birthday party on a Magna Doodle.
Oh my gosh, that's awesome.
There's a script. I will send you the script.
Yeah.
And script makes it sound like a protocol. Yep. It's not a protocol at all. It's a process. It's flexible, but the hardest part is just sticking to it and writing down what people say where they say it. But because of how it's created as a bi-directional process, the outcome is psychological flexibility. That's the intended outcome of ACT, is psychological flexibility.
Yeah.
And so when you are showing the matrix to people, you are promoting your own psychological flexibility. And I would say, I don't like to tell people what to do often, but if your aim is to go out and promote other people's psychological flexibility, then you probably better should start with your own.
Yeah. And I mean, I think obviously training and learning how to do it's important. You don't just want to sort of, print a matrix off a Google form and start going out on your own and try to figure it out. It's good to get a bit of education, but it seems agreeable that one does not need to, have master's level training in order to sort of implement the matrix. And so that's cool. And do folks generally agree with that? Like, are folks not concerned with sort of folks operating outside of their scope or whatever, because, maybe an undergrad or a psych student or, just anyone, a social worker, whoever is using the ACT matrix, that seems to be cool. Like, there's not going to be like an ethics violation or a code writing or that sort of thing happening because you're using something that's, and you're not supposed to be or whatever.
No, Kevin created it and then gave it away for free.
Perfect. And Kevin is Kevin actually a behavior analyst himself?
No, Kevin's a clinical psychologist.
Oh, so there you go. So it wasn't even originally created by us folks they're sort of caught in our own world. So that's cool. So in terms of sort of then learning the matrix, what sort of, and I understand there's a bit of a conflict of interest when I ask these questions, because I know you guys all offer training and continuing education in this area. But for someone who's brand new to this concept of the matrix and wants to start applying it, what's the best place to start?
So I will say there is a URL called Teach Me RFT.
Okay.
Teach Me RFT for relational frame theory.
Yeah.
And that is Kevin and Phil doing a very accessible overview from functional contextualism, ABA, acceptance and commitment training. And it really answers questions about where did it come from? How does this match up with ABA? And like, when should you be attempting to implement psychological flexibility as the skill? I mean, we don't always do that. Right? I'm not going to promote psychological flexibility when teaching somebody to cross the street. Like, no derived relational responding allowed, period.
That's right.
There's only, right? Like, I will tell you to stop.
Yeah.
So if we just think of like a continuum of instruction where we have, direct, discrete trial training all the way to promoting derived relational responding, which is psychological flexibility. It depends on the context. So that Teach Me RFT, and that is the Matrix Talk Crowdcast channel, where there's over 300 hours of free workshops of Kevin, Phil, Monica's on there, Mary's on there, I'm on there, showing the matrix in all different contexts. But it is free. There's tons of different topics, and it always starts with loops. And typically Mondays are beginning. So we talk about just the 2 loops, promoting psychological flexibility. Wednesdays are an intermediate ACT type thing. And then Fridays are advanced functional contextualism, relational frame theory stuff. There's some paid stuff. We have patrons, but a lot of free.
So really finances do not have to be a barrier for anyone to sort of get some competency in this. Now, all of y'all are the certified ACT matrix. What are you?
we are certified facilitators with the ACT Matrix, which is an important distinction because there's no official certification in ACT. And so it's not an ACT certification. It's actually, there was a lawyer named Ron Pizzo who Monica has met because he's up there in Nova Scotia, Halifax, right? Or you're in Halifax, or is Ron? Yep. So anyways, he's a lawyer who does a lot of mediation stuff. And he was learning the Matrix and working with Kevin and said, hey, could you give me some kind of like credential? And Kevin was like, sure.
Okay.
Sure.
But then, once one person has a certification, other people want it.
Yep.
And so they just started offering through the ACT Matrix Academy a certified facilitator of the ACT and Prosocial Matrix.
And that's what you recently got, Mary? Is that right? What I saw? Or is it, okay. Yeah. And so what does that mean? What does it mean to sort of attain that? What have you achieved by attaining that title? Not much, because Phil just made it up.
Practice.
Yeah, I mean, and again, it's a performance-based certification. So we have masterminds 3 or 4 days a week. I think we're 3 days a week now. Show up, and it's like, if you want to learn the ACT Matrix, I would suggest that you go to the person who created it. And Kevin is available 3 days a week on Crowdcast, 3 days a week on Zoom. It's it's ridiculously affordable. For a while, I was the only one who showed up with the 2 of them, and I was sure that they were going to stop showing up, but that's what they do. And it's, you show them your process, and they'll give you feedback on if it's not judgmental or judgmental. And then
I love showing up when it's just them.
Yeah. They are, I mean, like the things you learn, they are, best parts of my day. I have spent every day since April 2020, at least 1 hour with them. And then I joined them working with them in October of 2020. So we are constantly creating stuff. We have new books since the last time we talked, Ben. We just published the Verbal Aikido and RFT book on Amazon, and a brand new Coaching with Individuals workbook on Amazon. So we're just creating stuff.
And is all that stuff, grounded in the Matrix? Is it all Matrix stuff? Or
Yes.
Right. And so you said it's like reasonable. Like, so what could that cost somebody to kind of week to week participate in that approximately?
$47 a month for a once a week meeting.
Yeah.
And then it goes up to
The second secret word is crowd.
$100 a month for twice a week, and then maybe $150 for 3 times a week.
Right. Good.
So that's it. And then the certification cost, I think, is around $1,100, and that can be split up. How you could do it $47 a month, and it would take a lot of months. Or you can split it up over 6 months, 12 months, whatever.
Gotcha.
It's
so
flexible.
Psychological flexibility with a flexible training schedule. Yeah. That's amazing.
They practice what they preach. What are you going to say?
Yeah, 100%.
Yeah.
And I really love sort of an early point you made about sort of the lack of jargon. I mean, I think that is one of the biggest sort of word I'm looking for, complaints or whatever about our field, is the use of jargon.
Yeah.
And the idea that, because I remember early on being taught, try to pair the jargon with the non-jargon so that, so folks will learn some of those terms. And this was what I was mentored to do, because we really want them to learn about stimulus control and those sorts of things, and be able to use that language. And I never really understood why, beyond, we think we're great, and therefore,
exclusivity.
Yeah. Therefore you should do it. And so has there been, I mean, I haven't seen much of it, but has there been kind of pushback at all from sort of, the traditional sort of behavior analyst sort of circles towards kind of having something like this that, is essentially, the wild, in a way, kind of the Wild West, because anyone could do it and anyone could jump in and anyone can sort of take training and just start applying this stuff, which, I would think might make some, staunch traditionalist behavior analysts kind of nervous that, that means that, they'll generalize and mean that's going to cause a whole lot of other problems. Have you seen any of that? Or, I mean, I haven't, but I'm not really in those circles.
I had a little, but mostly it's been more of like almost kind of like a mimicking the use of yucky, like they're like, oh, the yucky stuff, right? But in those situations, I mean, it used to bug me at first, and I'm be like, oh my god, like we're so rigid.
Yeah.
But now I use it so much that even like I'm finding that the people I'm around or supporting are using it, and we're using it like as in like, hey, that was like super yucky and uncomfortable.
Yeah.
Right. And so it's kind of just, it's new. It can be new for some, especially if you're used to saying things, like challenging behavior or aversives and stuff like that. And instead we're like, relief behavior and that yucky stuff. Like it's just getting essentially desensitized to different words that mean the same thing. We're sorting out, some stuff, some like that private events and the, our behavior on a piece of paper, and it works.
I mean, I imagine one of the nice things about the Matrix is even if there is sort of pushback or complaints or whatever, you folks can just take the Matrix and get yourself all zen.
Where would you put that?
Get yourself all zen and chill about it all,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Where would you put jargon on the Matrix?
I see this is bothering you, so let's do a Matrix and talk about it. Yeah.
So you think I'm not using terms that are technical enough, and where might you put technical terms up here on your diagram? Right, it becomes awesome. And that's the verbal Aikido part. Is the I'm going to take your words because they're and I'm going to invite you to sort them out and notice your relationship.
I love that.
And while I invite you, I'm also going to sort mine out, right? And I'm going to model that, right?
Yeah. Aikido. I love that. The idea of sort of, because that's something, certainly again, in the group home context, we often come up against is sort of that, that violent pushback, and to be able to sort of just suddenly go, let's put that here and carry on the conversation. Is
that
just,
something you'd prefer to approach or avoid?
It's just amazing. Yeah.
And when you did that, I wonder, did you notice relief or satisfaction showing?
Yeah.
With the group home, so because I'm still supporting group homes, but I got asked to do like a 4-series behavior support training for an entire agency.
Yeah.
And so I just did the first one, and they were thinking, okay, they're going to tell us about positive reinforcement and what are consequences and all that. I did a 4-hour training, all Matrix as my first training, because I'm like, that's how we're just like opening everything up, we're flexing everybody up before we do any other training. I could throw in some technical terms later if I felt it was necessary, but 4 hours of Matrix first. And then we'll go into session 2 and we'll talk about how that fits into those antecedents and, what our behavior and their behavior and how, we kind of influence each other. You could tie it into anything. I've tied it into CPI, the nonviolent crisis intervention, because, they talk a lot about integrated experience.
Yes.
And it all ties in together. It ties in together with antecedents and behavior and consequence, and it ties in together in using the Matrix and sorting out, our own responses in comparison to the persons we're supporting.
Oh, that's really interesting, and I know
it's a really peaceful, like crisis debriefing tool as well, that prevents exposing people to more of that aversive event than they would like to be exposed to.
That's cool.
I do every debrief I'm doing, I'm using the Matrix. And if it's a tough one, perhaps I might just say, what's working, versus what's not working in this situation, and sorting out individual debriefing sessions. But, some of us are working with some really difficult behavior, and we don't necessarily spend enough time debriefing and sorting things out with the persons who perhaps were on the receiving end of some pretty intense headbutts, right?
I love all this. It's so cool. One thing I was kind of wondering about was two things I'm wondering about, and they're kind of separate. The first one is particularly in well, it's not in just group homes, kind of in any of these contexts. Often we're also trying to sort of empower teams or families or whatever to be able to do this stuff on their own. So, is there a component or a piece where you're actually teaching these folks to do this stuff themselves?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I've written it in as the non-contingent detention protocol. And then also the teaching tool for social, emotional, problem solving, whatever. And then also the debrief after an escalation. So I've written it into plans that way.
And so these teams are then going through the matrix themselves with their coworkers without you being there?
Yeah, and with the clients. Yeah.
Wow. And how does that go? Like, does that like, there's probably a little bit of BSD in there to sort of make sure they're, kind of getting it right. And do you find they're some of them are all right at it? I mean, I see some nonverbals here that folks won't be able to hear in the audio, but
yeah, I mean, it's not like it has to be perfect, right? It's a process. And it's they're driving the boat versus us coming in and saying, I need you to do this. Here's the behavior support plan, and here are the contingencies, and you must reinforce immediately after response. And if you don't, I gave you my recommendations, right? Yeah. And we know that extrinsic motivation doesn't work on ourselves. So what are we doing going in and trying to change behavior using the same sort of method, right? Yeah. Even if people, they do the matrix, we do it with them, we work through it, we sort out some behaviors. They might not, the next time you see them, they might not have been, that might not have been the first thing on their mind, because they're, they're in it, right? Especially when it's their child or someone close to them, you got the emotional piece. But they will come to you with something, and it's that opportunity where you can draw them back to the matrix, so I've done the matrix with parents, and you go back and you ask them like, hey, what have you noticed since the last time we met? And I had a parent once say like, oh, I'm sorry, I'm really sorry, I didn't have time to do that thing that you left me, but what happened? And then they start venting the most recent traumatic events they've had to experience in their home. And I will just, pull out a piece of paper and say like, hey, are you okay if we sort this out and let's write it down together? And they're always willing to let you do that in my experience. Right?
I like this intrinsic motivation thing too, because and it makes me think about a bit about, I'm tangenting here to kind of the problems with ABA and ABA reform and ABA's abuse and all that kind of stuff. And one of the biggest sort of criticisms that we get as a field is our reliance on these external rewards, on these external sort of contrived reinforcers or whatever. And in fact, I just read a LinkedIn post. It was an autistic advocate who was posting about this piece, and someone was coming on and asking, well, is ABA still dependent on external reinforcers? And a couple BCBAs came on. Well, yes, we are. That's all that we have to use those. That's the way things go. And so this seems like a really nice sort of tool to sort of maybe help shape up some of those discussions as well, because the idea that you can start with internal natural reinforcement right away with this process is something kind of unheard of in our field. I
would say unheard of in some programs, because my program was heavily emphasized moving as quickly as possible to natural, social, intrinsic, all of that. But mine was not a very autism heavy program at all.
But and it's moving too.
So,
whereas there's no moving to.
Yeah.
You're already there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Which I think is
Because we're all
unique.
born with intrinsic motivation, right?
Yeah.
Like nobody
Yeah.
has to externally reinforce walking behavior in children, typically developing children, right?
Yeah.
And we don't ever correct them for it either.
No.
We don't say like, "Oh, dummy, you better put the right foot." Nobody does that.
Yeah.
So we're born with it, and we can really do a good job of suppressing it as human. So generalization is a big thing that we should be moving towards, and that drive relational responding. I mean, generalization at its finest, top tier, responding to one thing based on its relation to another without direct instruction. That's generalization. So
I think one thing for like my own development for next steps is because I don't only consult in group homes, but also family homes. The parents who are 74 years old and they're still caring for their 46-year-old adult children. And I get referred by the psychiatrist for some challenging behaviors. I think my next step is using the matrix to work with the families in terms of figuring out what's important to them and helping them notice different things. At that age, behavior change and my role, or my traditional role in coming in and consulting and helping some of these behaviors go down, that's not where I'm necessarily needed, and helping the family kind of navigate what they do need. And that's not up to me to tell them, but helping. I think I'd like to go into that a little bit for those family referrals, because it's a different ball game when you're consulting with older caregivers who are tired and burnt out and with their own health conditions and concerns.
Yeah, absolutely.
We get stuck there, I find, where we go in and we're like, okay, who's the primary client, or who's the primary person we're there for? And we forget the role that the caregivers play and their lives and their families and other caregivers or schools, and sometimes we're supporting large teams. And if we have to actually, behavior change involves everybody, not just, the one individual, unless we're going to sit down and work with them ourselves. And typically, especially in like adult services and schools, I'm helping and supporting big teams here who are supporting some, big students with some big behaviors. And, sure, I can sit down with the student and I might be able to do some one-on-one stuff, but they need something that also helps guide their own behavior. And by helping people recognize and notice, the things that are important to them, like notice that safety is important to them. And when things happen, fear shows up, and then I run, right? And we get stuck on, like, just as in human beings, with trying to make the yucky stuff go away, right? We go to the doctor, we're anxious, we ask for medication. We're not asking for medication so that it just lessens it. We're asking for medication to make it go away. Because as a group of humans, we just want that yucky stuff to go away. And so we're always focusing on make it go away so it never ever shows up again. And that's not the case. There will always be yucky stuff in our heads, because that's our learned history right there. We've been taught all those words over, time, from birth to your current present. We're learning different things, and we're all experiencing yucky stuff. And my yucky is going to be different from your yucky, and it's going to be different from the student with aggressive behavior.
I have one more question, because I know Tina's office is about to be imploded by the custodians. And it's around. I'm curious about research. I haven't seen. I know there's lots of research on ACT and RFT and all those sorts of things. Is it well? Two-part question: is there actually research on the matrix? Number one. And two, if not, is that because basically the matrix is just taking all the concepts from ACT, which all have the research behind it? So any ideas? Because I haven't seen research on it.
There was somebody that I saw at IBAO last year, and part of her, I have a ton of cards, like like business cards.
Yes.
Maybe. Yeah. And I can't for the life of me remember which person it was.
Yeah.
So I can get that name to you after.
Yeah.
But there was a woman that I saw, and I know she was doing a workshop.
Yeah.
She used the matrix as part of her research. Like I completely forget what she was looking at, but she used the matrix as like the first part of, and then she went into like of the verbal functional analysis, like functional analysis, verbal behavior and stuff like that. So it was really cool. So I can get that name. So I think it is developing. It was so interesting to hear her talk and learn more about how she did it. Anyway, I wasn't able to attend her seminar, like her workshop, only the little 50-minute presentation she gave. But yeah, I was.
Gina, do you know, is there specific kind of research on the matrix, or is it more just a way of applying the already done research on sort of ACT concepts in another way?
There are, if you're looking for like research articles, a few using the ACT matrix, they're out there, but it's also a tool that pulls together all of the other things that we already have research for. So it's, an applied process.
Sort of wondering about that sort of evidence-based practice kind of piece, I guess.
Yeah. So that's the cool thing about being in an applied science is we get to take this research that person did and this research that person did and go, I wonder what might happen if I applied this, right? And it's a visual. So yes, we have evidence for visuals are effective at promoting skill acquisition. It is a functional contextual point of view. So it has positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, all of those principles. It's a sorting activity. And sorting is a way to bring order to complex problems. So, but there are some articles I can send you. Kevin, there was one recently using it in athletics. I think hockey or tennis.
I think it would just be interesting to see like a study like and maybe Mary or Monica will do this one day. Like the mindfulness-based PBS articles that Nirbhay Singh did, where he basically took the PBS process in an RCT and then compared it to a PBS process plus mindfulness and found all these gangs. It would be interesting to see a PBS process and then a PBS process with the matrix and sort of compare that. I think that'd be a neat study for someone to do one day.
I would like to look at the social validity piece of, using the matrix for behavior change versus, straight up, contingencies, like that intrinsic motivation versus extrinsic motivation. Where were we going to see the behavior change? What are we going to see fastest? Where are we going to get that, so-called buy-in, which if you do the matrix, you don't need buy-in. That's where I curious about is like really just asking parents and caregivers what they think.
At contextualscience.org, which is the Association for Contextual Behavior Science, they have a page of all randomized controlled trial studies from 1986 to present. So if you search matrix on there, you can find
probably pick up some stuff there. Cool.
Yeah.
I just know some people will ask that question.
I have a phone call tomorrow with a graduate student who wants to use the matrix in a BST model to teach BCBAs to teach RBTs and notice if it promotes psychological flexibility.
Really neat.
On the ACT, private events, mentalism, things like that, what I will always defer to is that Skinner simply said that the behavior of study should be observable behaviors. What we should be studying is the observable behaviors, which is the target behavior for change, which makes sense with acceptance. We don't need to measure private events because we aren't attempting to change private events. So they don't need to be measured.
Yes. No, that's a really good point. Yeah. Cool. Well, I don't want Tina to get trapped in there. So sort of any last thoughts to share with the folks before we go? This was really cool. I love being able to chat with a few people at once. I'll have to do this more often.
Get out and do stuff.
Get out and do stuff. Nice.
Show up, do stuff, notice the consequences of your behaviors.
Yeah.
Notice the workability.
Right on.
Or not.
But the world is run by people who show up and do stuff.
Yeah. Yeah. I love that. Well, thanks, you three. This was a cool idea. Mary kind of contacted me and thought about bringing you all together. I thought this was super awesome. And I'm really glad you all did. And, I look forward to doing it again sometime.
Well, thanks so much for having us, Ben. This was great.
Awesome.
Yeah, thank you. Monica, thanks for staying up so late.
Yes, Monica. That's right. Oh my gosh. 9:45. Holy.
I hope you get some rest before tomorrow's boot camp session.
Goodness me. All right. Okay.
Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
The third secret word is towards.